I still remember the way her hand lingered, just a second longer than it had to, brushing against mine when she handed me the receipt, and suddenly my chest was too loud for the quiet of the bookstore. I wasn't supposed to notice. She was my girlfriend's best friend, a fact that felt heavier in my mind than it should, but I couldn't unsee the subtle pull of her smile, the way her eyes lingered just enough that it made me question what just friends really meant. I had started coming to this corner bookstore more often than necessary. Not because I needed the books, though I liked that the shelves smelled like old paper in winter, but because she worked here. Her name was Marianne. She moved among the stacks with a confidence that made it seem effortless, like she had memorized not just the titles, but the lives of everyone who walked in. I had never been the type to notice women in that way before, at least not like this. It was a Tuesday, overcast and sticky with the scent of rain, when she called me over to help reach a high shelf. I stumbled, of course, almost dropping the book, and she laughed, not a loud, hollow laugh, but a warm, measured one, the kind that fills the space between words. Her eyes caught mine, and for a moment, the hum of the fluorescent lights felt too loud. She handed me the book, our fingers brushing ever so slightly. "Careful," she said softly, and I nodded, though I was still trying to recover from the jolt of electricity in that small contact. She was in her mid-40s, I guessed, though she carried it like an accessory, graceful, sure of herself, but not untouchable. There was a subtle elegance in the way she adjusted her scarf, the slight quirk in her smile when she caught someone staring, the way she listened, not just nodded, but really listened. I watched her talk to a customer a few moments later, her voice calm, measured, yet something underneath it seemed untouchable. I kept noticing things about her I shouldn't have. The faint freckle on her left hand, the way her hair fell across one side of her face when she leaned in, the soft sigh she let out when a customer returned a book late. I was aware of her without wanting to be, aware of the warmth she carried even in silence. Later, she offered me a cup of coffee she had made from the little break room corner, and I didn't even know I needed it until I held it. She didn't linger with words, but her presence filled the room, her calmness somehow tugging at the edges of my anxiety. I wanted to say something clever, or funny, or normal, but I just nodded, held the cup, and tried not to let my fingers brush hers again. We stood there for a beat longer than necessary. I don't know if she noticed, or if she did, what it meant, but the way she looked at me, just for a fraction longer than polite, made the world feel too small and too big at once. When I finally left the bookstore that afternoon, rain drizzling against the windows, I found myself replaying the moment over and over. Not the laugh, not the smile, but the hand. The hand that lingered just a second too long. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I showed up at the bookstore a few days later, ostensibly to pick up a book Marianne had saved for me. In truth, I think I just wanted an excuse to see her again, to linger in the quiet between the shelves where she moved like she owned the air around her. She was already there, perched on a rolling ladder, straightening a row of novels with meticulous care. "Hey," I said softly, trying not to startle her. She turned, a small smile on her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a tension there, a careful restraint. She set the ladder aside and gestured for me to follow. "Thanks for helping yesterday," she said, though it sounded more like a formality than gratitude. I noticed everything. The way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for a book on the top shelf, the faint dark circles beneath her eyes, the way she rubbed her temple, as if holding back more than just fatigue. She was guarded, always composed, but there were cracks, even small ones, where the real Marianne slipped through. We worked together to organize a stack of returned books, and I tried to keep my eyes on the task at hand, though every so often I'd catch her glancing at me. Quick, almost imperceptible. Her laugh came softly when I made a clumsy joke about a leaning pile of encyclopedias. It wasn't loud or rehearsed, just a brief release, like a secret she wasn't ready to share. At one point, she paused mid-sort, leaning against the counter. Her shoulders sagged, and she exhaled so quietly I thought I might have imagined it. I didn't ask if she was okay. I just kept moving books, my hands brushing against hers accidentally more than once. Each time, I felt that same strange electricity, low and insistent, tugging at me. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" I asked finally, gesturing vaguely to the chaos of returned volumes. She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the floor. "Sometimes," she admitted. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. "But then, I like knowing someone's going to find what they're looking for. It makes it worth it." Her vulnerability surprised me. Marianne had this aura of certainty, of control, and yet here she was, letting a sliver of weariness slip through. It made her human in a way I hadn't expected, and I wanted to protect that fragment of her even as my chest ached with something I didn't understand yet. We reached for the same dictionary at the same time, our fingers brushing. She pulled back, just a little, and I noticed the faint flush on her cheek. Neither of us spoke for a moment, just standing there amid the scent of old paper and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. The silence felt charged, like the air before a storm. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile and said, "Thanks. Not for the book, not for helping, just thanks." And when our hands separated, I caught myself staring at her for longer than I should have, wondering how someone could feel so close and yet remain untouchably distant. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that pause, the way she let herself be seen for just a fraction of a second, and the quiet pull I felt toward her in that small, impossible space between us. The rain came suddenly, turning the streets outside the bookstore into rivers of reflected light. We had stayed late, sorting through a pile of newly returned books no one else seemed to care about. The store smelled faintly of wet jackets and old paper, and the hum of the fluorescent lights made everything feel suspended in a kind of quiet limbo. I was stacking a set of poetry books when Marian walked past me, carrying a box of novels. She brushed against my side just enough to make me pause, heart hammering in a way that felt almost ridiculous. She didn't say anything, just a quick glance, a fleeting smile, and a shake of her head as if scolding herself for some unspoken misstep. "Careful," I murmured, reaching out slightly to steady the box she was holding. Her hands were warm, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the rest of the world had dissolved. Our eyes met, and I wanted to say something. Anything, but the words got stuck somewhere behind my teeth. She shifted, just slightly, enough to create distance, yet close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her shoulder. She laughed softly, almost nervously. "You always hover," she said, but the tone wasn't teasing. It was gentle, almost confessional, like she'd let a fragment of herself slip out without meaning to. I wanted to ask her if she'd ever been alone in moments like this, late nights, quiet rooms, with someone else's attention pressing against the edges of propriety. But I didn't. Instead, I kept stacking books, pretending my hands weren't trembling, my thoughts scattered between desire and guilt. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before she smiled politely and silenced it. I couldn't see the screen, but I imagined it was him, her ex, a friend, someone who had a claim on her world that I wasn't supposed to touch. My chest ached in response, a mixture of longing and frustration that I tried to hide behind the monotony of folding spines. The storm outside tapped a rhythm against the windows, a reminder that time was moving whether we noticed it or not. I caught her glancing at me again, lips parted slightly, and for a moment, the air between us was almost unbearable. I could almost reach out and brush the hair from her face, could almost let her lean against me just to see if it fit, if it made sense. But then she shifted, gathering the box more securely, and the moment dissipated. We stepped around each other in careful choreography, pretending the space between us was normal when it was anything but. My hand itched to linger, to close the distance that our bodies seemed to skirt around with polite hesitation. She gave a small sigh, a sound I felt more than I heard, and turned toward the counter. I stood frozen for a heartbeat longer, watching her back, tracing the curve of her shoulder with my eyes, wondering how close was too close and how much closer I wanted to be. And in that suspended second, when the storm rattled the glass and the world felt too still, I could almost reach for her. We were alone in the back corner of the bookstore, the late afternoon light slanting through the dusty windows and casting everything in gold. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick with wet leaves and a strange kind of stillness. I was stacking books mechanically, but I wasn't really seeing them. Marianne leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely, eyes tracing something far away. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words wouldn't come out. The silence stretched, heavy, pressing against us in a way that made my chest ache. Finally, she spoke, and it was quieter than I expected. "Do you ever wonder what we're doing?" I froze, hands hovering over the books, caught between relief and panic. The question wasn't about romance. It was more existential, more dangerous in its honesty. It hung between us like a fragile glass ornament, ready to shatter. I started but stopped. Any answer felt inadequate. I couldn't say what I was feeling without sounding like an idiot. I could only nod, letting my eyes stay on hers a little too long, trying to convey the storm inside me without words. She took a slow breath, and I noticed the small things I hadn't before. The faint tremor in her fingers, the way her shoulders slumped despite her usual poise, the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't invincible, wasn't untouchable. She was human, vulnerable, real. "I mean this," she continued softly, "us whatever this is. It doesn't make sense, and I don't know if it should." Her words were careful, measured, but they hit harder than anything I'd ever felt. I wanted to reach for her, to steady the weight of the confusion, but I didn't. My hands stayed buried in the books, trembling just enough that she might notice. We stared at each other across that small, cluttered space, the only sound the faint hum of the lights and the rustle of paper. There was no malice, no accusation, just a quiet reckoning. I could see the fatigue in her eyes, the tension she carried even when she tried not to, and it made me ache to be the cause, the witness, or maybe something else entirely I wasn't ready to name. "I can't," she whispered finally, looking down at her hands. "I can't pretend anymore that this is nothing, and I don't know how to stop thinking about it." Her confession wasn't about love, not yet. It was about awareness, about the impossible gravity that had grown between us. And even in that moment, I understood that nothing would be the same. The balance, the polite routines, the facade of friendship, they were gone. I swallowed hard, words stuck somewhere behind my throat, and simply nodded. I didn't know what to say. Nothing I could say would fix it, or make it less complicated, or erase the pull I felt toward her. We didn't move. We didn't touch. But the air between us felt electric, raw, exposed. And in the silence that followed, I realized how fragile everything had become. I don't know if I should be standing here with you," she said finally, voice cracking just slightly. "And yet, I can't walk away either." And just like that, I felt it. How impossible it was to stay rational, how dangerous it was to care this much, and how inevitable it felt that neither of us would leave unchanged. I found her sitting on the floor near the poetry section, knees drawn up, a crumpled piece of paper in her hands. I had been sorting a pile of returned novels when I noticed the way her shoulders slumped, heavier than usual. She looked up when I approached, startled, and for a moment I thought I'd interrupted something private. But the expression on her face wasn't irritation. It was fragility. "I didn't mean for you to see this," she said, voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of the fluorescent lights. I crouched beside her, careful not to crowd her. "It's fine. I'm curious, if that's okay." She unfolded the paper slowly. It was a letter, the ink slightly faded, edges frayed. Her thumb traced a line as if memorizing every curve of the words. "It's from a long time ago," she said finally. "Someone I thought I'd never get over." The honesty in her voice made my chest tighten. Marian had always carried herself with poise, like she had solved the equation of her life neatly. But here, with the letter trembling slightly in her hands, she was unguarded, human, exposed. I didn't reach for her, though every instinct screamed to. Instead, I remembered the story she'd once mentioned, in passing, about a friend she had lost, someone she loved in a way that never quite fit into the world. I reminded her gently, softly, "It wasn't your fault. You did what you could." She looked at me then, really looked, and there was a flicker of something raw in her eyes. Grief, yes, but also relief, or maybe recognition that someone saw the part of her she usually hid. She let out a shaky breath. "I thought I'd buried it," she whispered. "But it's still here, isn't it?" I nodded, not because I had the right answers, but because acknowledgement felt more real than any words of comfort could. The bookstore seemed quieter suddenly, the hum of the lights louder, as if everything had slowed down just for us. We sat together in silence, and I noticed the details I'd always missed: the tiny scar on her wrist, the faint lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled, even faintly, and the way her hands held the letter, protective and fragile at once. I felt a tug in my chest I couldn't name, a mixture of awe and something more dangerous: longing. She exhaled slowly and let the paper fall to her lap. "I don't usually show this to anyone," she admitted, voice soft. Maybe I just wanted someone to know that part of me exists." I stayed close, careful not to invade, careful only to be present. "I see it," I said. "Not just the letter, not just the heartbreak, but her. The Marianne who carried loss like a quiet shadow, who smiled even when it hurt." And in that quiet, almost imperceptible moment, our proximity shifted. Nothing had changed outwardly, and yet something inside us had shifted permanently. The air felt heavier, charged in a way that made my skin tingle, my heart ache, my mind race with possibilities I wasn't ready to name. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I caught the vulnerability that made her magnetic, the unspoken pull that had been building since the first time our hands brushed. And then she whispered, almost to herself, "I didn't think anyone would ever understand that." And I realized, without wanting to, that maybe I already did. The bookstore was closing. The last customers had left, leaving only the quiet hum of the lights and the soft shuffle of our footsteps over the wooden floor. Marianne was perched on the edge of the counter, the faint light catching the strands of her hair, the subtle curve of her shoulders. I lingered nearby, unsure if I was supposed to move closer or just stay, suspended in the space we had quietly claimed. We didn't speak at first. Words felt unnecessary. The tension that had built between us over weeks, months even, was finally allowed to settle, not with fireworks or confessions, but with the simple acknowledgement of what had been there all along. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing a line along the edge of the counter. I watched her, memorizing the small details, the way her gaze softened when it caught mine, the faint tremor in her hand, the quiet exhaustion that clung to her like a shadow. It made her real in a way no distance or restraint could hide. "I don't think I can pretend anymore," she said finally, voice low, almost swallowed by the hush of the room. "Not that we're just friends." I swallowed, careful not to overreact, careful to honor the fragility in her admission. I didn't need her to say more. I had known, or at least felt it, every time our hands brushed, every stolen glance, every silent pause that said more than words ever could. I moved just slightly closer, keeping the distance gentle, respectful, and she didn't pull away. My hand hovered for a moment before I let it rest lightly over hers on the counter. Her fingers twitched beneath mine, not pulling away, not forcing closeness either, just letting it exist. We stayed like that for a while. No declarations, no promises, just presence. It was heavier than any grand statement could have been, and somehow infinitely more intimate. The chaos of unspoken feelings, of longing, of near misses, had been replaced by understanding, mutual, earned, inevitable. She leaned back slightly, her shoulder brushing mine, small contact that felt monumental. I felt her exhale again, soft and steady this time, like she was allowing herself to exist in that moment fully, without shame, without fear. I could feel the quiet shift in us, the way our rhythm had aligned over months of cautious proximity and lingering glances. It wasn't love declared, it wasn't a fairy tale climax. It was something subtler, deeper, and somehow truer, a collapse into the truth of what had been waiting between us all along. Her eyes met mine, and we shared that long, unspoken acknowledgement. The air was charged with what we didn't say, what we had almost lost, and what we had finally decided to accept. Finally, we stood together in silence, hands brushing, shoulders touching, letting the quiet settle over us like a soft, unbreakable bond. There was no need to rush, no need to define it. It existed in the small, simple, human way it always had. And as the lights flickered, signaling the end of another day, I felt the subtle finality of it. We were here. We were together. And it was enough. I still think about that time in the bookstore, months later, when everything quietly shifted between Marianne and me. The memory isn't sharp or cinematic. It's soft, like sunlight through a dusty window, a warmth that lingers long after the moment has passed. But the impact remains, lodged somewhere in my chest, a reminder of how fragile and persistent human connection can be. Looking back, I realize how much we both changed. I used to rush through life, thinking clarity came from action, from solving problems, from moving forward without hesitation. She, on the other hand, carried the weight of experience with careful grace, sometimes hiding her vulnerability behind composure. Being near her taught me the value of presence, the power of noticing, waiting, and simply being. I learned how much patience love sometimes demands, and how small gestures, holding a hand, a shared silence, a glance that lingers, can hold more meaning than any grand declaration. She, too, shifted. Marianne allowed herself to be seen in ways she had resisted for years, not because she changed entirely, but because she trusted that someone might meet her there without judgment or expectation. She let her walls soften around me, and in doing so, discovered that intimacy doesn't have to be loud to be profound. Vulnerability became a quiet strength rather than a weakness. Our connection wasn't perfect. It never was. There were still moments of hesitation, lingering doubt, and the kind of self-consciousness that comes with caring deeply. But it became something alive, a slow-burning presence that demanded attention and respect. And in that, I think we both learned the same truth. Love isn't about grand gestures or timing aligning perfectly. It's about noticing, staying, and quietly choosing each other over and over, even when the world says you shouldn't. Now, months later, when I pass that bookstore, I sometimes pause at the door and catch a glimpse of her inside. She looks up, sees me, and the small smile she gives is enough to fill the empty spaces I didn't know existed before. That lingering warmth, the subtle electricity of recognition, reminds me that some connections, once formed, remain, even if the circumstances change. The story didn't end with fireworks or dramatic revelation. It ended with something steadier, an earned understanding between two people who chose to see each other fully, quietly, and without pretense. And in that understanding, I found a peace I hadn't realized I was searching for all along. It's a slow, imperfect kind of love, one that doesn't demand perfection, only presence. And somehow, that makes it far more real than anything I could have imagined. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?